In light of Trump's change of heart in China-U.S. trade tensions, I spoke with two American experts who offered their insights on the unfolding China-U.S. trade roller coaster. Those interviews after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program comes to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. China and the U.S. are now in talks to defuse the potential trade war. To weigh in on the long-term relationship between the two countries and China's reform, I recently caught up with Joseph Stiglitz, a Columbia University professor who's also a Nobel laureate in economics. Professor Stiglitz has been coming to China and engaging with Chinese economic policymakers and business elites for 37 years. He stressed the significance of multilateral mechanisms, such as WTO, in dealing with trade disputes. You are outspoken about the recent development between China and United States trade disputes. What are you exactly suggesting?
What I suggested a year ago when Trump got first elected and he promised to engage in strong trade, I said, you have to understand that Trump is a bully. You can't engage in appeasement. I also said that you ought to respond within the international rule of law, go to the WTO and file a case, because I believe that what the United States has done is not WTO compliant. I think China should take the high road and have the view of the long run. Most of us in the United States view Trump as a temporary phenomena. The question is, what is the long-term relationship between China and the United States? And that is what really needs to be the focus of discussion.
But the thing is, people only realize now that these are very important suggestions. Are we wasting our time? 1 year already?
No, I think it was not clear how Trump was going to proceed. He proceeded actually surprisingly slowly, but now in his second year, it appears he's much more aggressive. He's pushed away the more moderate voices inside the administration, surrounded him with hawks. What we also don't know is whether the U.S. courts, how active they will be. A year ago, many of us had hoped that the Republicans would be able to tame President Trump.
Didn't happen.
Didn't happen. Even as he done some of the most outrageous things, they've not spoken out, and that's been, for me as an American, extremely disappointing. But our courts have responded. They've stopped the terrible things like the travel ban on Muslims entering into the United States. The question is whether Trump's actions in these areas are compliant with U.S. law. They're not compliant with the WTO law, but I think they're probably not compliant with U.S. law. We haven't yet seen that kind of legal action. I guess we'll just have to wait and see whether it happens.
It seems that the rest of the world is now being dragged down by the American politics. Everything seems to be now decided by what's happening within the domestic politics inside the United States, even about trade issues. So what would this mean for international economy, for the world's economy?
Well, I think it's really important for the international community to go ahead with you might say a WTO minus the United States. If it continues, mean that the WTO will not be able to adjudicate cases in an effective manner. It seems to me we're coming to a crossroads. And at this point, what needs to happen is the rest of the world has to come together and say, we believe in the international rule of law. It's important to have global governance, international rule of law. And those of us who are critical, we raise our voices to say we have to change this or that, but very strongly supportive of an international rule of law.
Yeah.
So that's what China's leadership could be very important, working with Europe and other countries. Let's get together and recognize if the United States is not going to be part of the international community, if it walks off from Paris, the rest of the world has to go ahead.
Yeah. The question is, there has been an agenda the world community should work on, and that agenda has been narrowed down by one country in various platforms intensively. So there seems to be very little things that people can work together to get, in a way, to save the system.
When Trump announced that he was going to leave Paris, within the United States there was a response. East Coast states, West Coast states said, Trump is not important. We're going to go ahead and more than meet the obligations of the United States. The rest of the world said, we're going to go ahead and meet the obligations because we know the survival of the planet is more important than Donald Trump. So that's an example where we did come together. I think the international community is going to have to decide, is the international rule of law in the area of trade important? And I think it is.
How do you think China will be able to streamline its own necessity to reform within the country and the outside pressure or the outside push? How does that work? What is kind of chemistry?
China is in a very different position today than it was 40 years ago or even 20 years ago or 15 years ago. So it seems to me important for China to decide for itself where it wants to go. It should recognize that most of the business community is actually supportive of the broad opening up of China and is not with President Trump. So President Trump represents a minority in the Republican Party, which is actually a minority in the United States. So the point I want to make is that it should be the government keeping its eye on what they think is best for China, aware that there's an external environment, aware that it's a big global economy. Most of the people in Europe don't agree with what President Trump is doing. So the basic thing is China has to keep its eye on the long run, not on the current noise coming out of Washington. And
go beyond the noise. Look through the noise.
Look through the noise. I think it's very important not to do anything which is inconsistent with what China believes is its long-run view of its development.
That's Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate in economics, coming from Columbia University. You're watching World Insight on CGTN. Another scholar we have today on U.S.-China ties is Graham Allison, a prominent American political scientist. He has been heavily involved in U.S. foreign and defense policy in 60s and 70s when the U.S. was dealing with the former Soviet Union. He is best known for coining the term Thucydides Trap to refer to the situation when a rising power causes fear in an established power which escalates towards war. He used the term to illustrate the relationship between the United States, the existing power, and China, the rising power, and war about the potential. But he said the Thucydides Trap is something both countries could avoid. How can they steer away from a physical war or a potential trade war? Let's listen in. Thucydides Trap, something you warned between China and the United States. Is it on the way to come, given the latest trade dispute?
I would say that Thucydides is probably watching carefully and saying everybody is on script. So unfortunately, I think the storyline looks like it's emerging.
What exactly is that storyline?
Well, the storyline is with a rising power, like Athens 2,500 years ago, or Germany 100 years ago, or China today, threatens to displace a ruling power, like the U.S. today. In general, the outcome is a war, catastrophic war. Now, not in all the cases. I look at the last 500 years, I find 16 cases when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, 12 of them in war, 4 of them in not war. So to say war inevitable would be a big mistake. So we hope this will be the fifth case of no war, not the 13th case.
You could argue now things are more connected than ever before.
Yes.
And probably this is a good thing.
Yes, and because that provides some ballast in the relationship. We have a great stakes in working together, but in this relationship in which, on the one hand, China feels bigger, stronger, deserves more say, more sway, feels like it's being confined, and the Americans think, wait a minute, we have to cling to the status quo because this is the order that's provided all.
Is the 60 billion tariffs on Chinese goods a sign of U.S. trying to maintain its power? Is that how it is?
I think Thucydides would say that's the kind of thing the ruling power might do, being threatened and fearful of the rising power, and imagining that these small actions would have some impact when actually they may be counterproductive.
That's exactly what I meant. In a way, is it going to help the incumbent power, or is it going to hurt the incumbent power?
Again, Thucydides would tell us that the behavior is one thing. It's thought to be constructive, but it's often destructive. So if you look at the ways in which Sparta felt obliged to come to the relief of Corinth, even though it didn't like Corinth and thought Corinth was acting against its interest, it still felt, I should do this, and then one thing leads to the other, and pretty soon they find themselves where they don't want to be. And I think a trade conflict in particular, if it escalated, could get both China and the U.S. doing things that, even though they don't make any sense, their blood is up, they're feeling the other one is pushing me around, and under those circumstances it becomes very dangerous.
Do you think the U.S. side would have any way of coming back to logic?
I certainly hope so, because I live in the U.S.
But what is backing you of thinking and hoping so?
Well, I say partly that I'm an optimistic person. I'm always hopeful. But I think that in the dynamics of the U.S., often there's an overreaction at one stage to which then the rest of the system pushes back a bit. And I think as people look at the danger in the relationship between the U.S. and China, there's some reason for thinking that it'll stabilize. But I would say not yet. And if I were betting, things will get worse before they get worse.
You mean the tariffs will be even higher?
Well, I think the 90 days is the beginning of it, but I think an even more interesting, and what Thucydides again teaches us, is that in this tense relationship or this dangerous dynamic, each misunderstands the other. So even when one or the other is trying to be helpful or trying to be more sensible, the other says, oh, well, I think it has an ulterior motive. So I think the risk of misunderstanding is very great, and then when you have great misunderstandings, the risk of misjudgments and mistakes become very large. So I think that's why communication between people and between the governments is so important.
Communication, whether it is successful or not, is based on trust, to a certain extent.
To a certain extent, yes.
But we are not seeing many cases of trust between this administration in Washington, D.C. and the current Chinese government, for example. Both of them are new, and yet we haven't seen anything that would come here as the basis for trust. Do we?
Well, it's a good question. So I think that sometimes Chinese talk about mutual trust, but if you look at the statement in the 19th Party Congress, it backs up a little bit, and it says mutual respect rather than trust. So I may not trust you, but I may have enough respect for you that we talk with each other, and I'm not sure you're telling the truth all the time. You're not sure I'm telling the truth all the time, but we're talking and we're listening and we're trying to understand. So I would say the first instance, mutual respect and some appreciation for each other's core interests.
One of the things, Professor Allison, is whether we have in your system any forces that would help to go back onto the track of discussion and negotiation.
Well, I think that they are in the system, and I think they will be even more so.
Who are they?
So the business community is one part, and especially the parts of the business community that know that they have the biggest stakes in China. So there's a lot of American companies that are very active in China. There's a lot of trade between the U.S. and China. There's a lot of people who consume goods that are made in China. So all those voices, as they discover that their interests are being threatened, will become, I think, more important. Whether they'll be sufficient to deal with the Trump administration, which has a very strong view on this matter, and a very unusual view, that is at least a view that's sharply different than the consensus view for the previous 3 or 4 decades, that's an uncertainty. Yeah.
People have been using the analogy of adult and child. I'm not sure whether it is the most appropriate to discuss of the matters between states, but the question is, the apparent child has a lot of power in hand. Where is the stabilizing factor that you are talking about?
My hope is that as we recognize the stakes for each of the parties, that you'll find more people in the system, in Congress, of which there are a number of people, in the business community, in the think tank community, and academic community like myself, saying, let's try to understand the bigger picture in which we have many vital interests between the U.S. and China, have been having serious competition. Can be very constructive, but it needs to be within a framework. So I think what we need to be doing is thinking how in this difficult transition and in this difficult dynamic, because it is true that China is getting bigger and stronger, and it is true that that has an impact on Americans and their consciousness and their role in the world. So trying to cope with this requires a great leap of imagination.
That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.